The first fake cop arrived at 17 minutes past 6 every morning. The second came 20 minutes later. By Friday, 3 black SUVs were parked outside the ranch, all displaying police lights, all carrying men who refused to show badges. They said the Homeowners Association had concerns about the property. Elias Voss told them to leave. They laughed. They didn't know he had spent 30 years designing security systems for facilities most people never learned existed, and they didn't know the steel bollards buried beneath his driveway weren't just barriers. They were remotely controlled. On the 7th morning, when 4 fake cops stormed through his gate at once, Elias pressed a single button, and every escape route slammed shut behind them. Elias Voss was 58 years old, a retired industrial security engineer who had spent 3 decades designing systems most people never saw and never thought about. He lived alone on a wide stretch of ranch land that bordered one of the wealthiest developments in the county, and he liked it that way. He was not a talker. He did not attend town meetings, did not host dinners, did not care what his neighbors thought of his fences or his gate, or the quiet way he kept to himself. He rose before dawn out of habit, walked the fence line twice a day, and spent his evenings reading old technical manuals he had written himself decades earlier, manuals that still sat on shelves at facilities he was no longer permitted to name. His land had been in the family for generations, though few people knew that, and fewer still knew why he refused to sell it. What they did know, or thought they knew, was that his ranch sat directly across the only access route into a stretch of undeveloped land the Homeowners Association had been eyeing for years. That road was worth more than most people realized, and one woman understood its value better than anyone. Maribel Crown was 51 years old, the president of the Homeowners Association, a woman who wore politeness like a second skin and wielded control like a scalpel. She had built her reputation over a decade of chairing meetings, resolving disputes, and turning an ordinary suburban board into something closer to a private empire, one where her word carried more weight than any bylaw on the books. She arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon with a lawyer at her side, a man named Dorian Pike, 44 years old, whose voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who had learned to make threats sound like courtesies. Maribel stepped out of her car in a cream-colored coat, smiling the way she smiled at every meeting she chaired, and she told Elias she had a number for him. $4 million. Cash, she said, structured however he liked, closing within 30 days. She expected gratitude. She expected relief. What she got was silence, and then a single sentence that would haunt her for months to come. "I don't sell what I've spent my life protecting," Elias said, and he did not raise his voice to say it. Maribel blinked, as if the words had physically struck her. She had made this kind of offer before, to other landowners on the edge of other developments, and every single one of them had signed within a week. $4 million was not a number people walked away from, not in this county, not for a stretch of dry pasture and a rusting equipment barn. She tried again, softer this time, listing the benefits, the tax advantages, the freedom he could buy himself somewhere quieter, a smaller place near the coast perhaps, where he wouldn't have to maintain a single fence post ever again. Elias let her finish. Then he repeated himself, word for word, and watched something in her expression shift from confusion into something colder. Dorian Pike stepped forward and mentioned, almost gently, that the association had ways of making life difficult for property owners who refused to cooperate with community planning. Elias did not answer that either. He simply opened the gate wide enough for their car to leave, and he watched them go, the dust from their tires settling slowly over the gravel behind them. That night, a black SUV parked outside his fence line for nearly 40 minutes. Nobody got out. Nobody approached. Whoever sat inside simply took photographs of the ranch, the barn, the long gravel driveway, and the gate itself, and then drove away into the dark without a word. Elias watched the whole thing from his kitchen window without moving, without reaching for his phone, cataloging the vehicle's shape and the angle of its headlights, the way he had once cataloged threats to buildings that could not afford to fail. The following morning brought a stack of paperwork thick enough to choke a filing cabinet. The Homeowners Association claimed Elias had built structures without proper permits, that his fencing failed to meet community standards, that his internal road created a safety hazard for delivery vehicles, and that his exterior lighting was disrupting the aesthetic character of the neighborhood. Elias read through every accusation twice, then a third time, and recognized each one as manufactured nonsense, designed to bury him in bureaucracy rather than convince an inspector of anything real. He hired an independent engineer to walk the property and document every structure, every fence post, every wire. The report came back clean. Everything on his land was legal, permitted, and built to code. Much of it built better than code required, because Elias never did anything halfway. He mailed copies of the report to the association himself, certified, with a return receipt requested, and waited to see whether anyone would bother reading it. 2 days later, Maribel summoned him to a full meeting of the Homeowners Association board. He went, mostly out of curiosity, and found himself standing in front of a dozen unfamiliar faces while Maribel repeated her offer, this time reframing it as an act of generosity toward a stubborn old rancher who did not understand what was good for him. She spoke of community harmony, of shared vision, of the burden he placed on his neighbors simply by existing where he existed. The number stayed the same. The tone did not. "You can take 4 million today," she said, loud enough for the room to hear, "or you can lose far more than that later." "Is that a threat?" Elias asked. "It's a warning," Maribel said, and she smiled again, the same smile from the driveway, except now it looked like something worn for an audience rather than felt. A few board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and one woman near the back lowered her eyes to the table, as if she already understood more than she was willing to say aloud. In the weeks that followed, Elias began paying closer attention to the footage from the cameras mounted around his property, cameras he had installed decades earlier out of habit more than necessity. He noticed a pattern he did not like. Figures approached the fence line at night, not to vandalize anything, not to cut wire or spray paint, but to measure distances and study the layout of his gate and driveway with the patient thoroughness of people planning an approach rather than a prank. They came back 3 separate nights that week, always after midnight, always leaving before dawn without disturbing a single post. Elias began logging their movements in a notebook he kept beside his bed, dates, times, and the direction each figure came from, the way he had once logged perimeter breaches for clients who paid him to notice things other people missed. On the 4th morning, Elias heard an engine outside his gate before the sun had fully risen. A black SUV idled at the entrance, and a man stepped out wearing a police uniform, walking toward the intercom with the practiced confidence of someone who expected doors to open the moment he spoke. The man announced himself as an officer responding to a complaint about the property. Elias asked for his full name, his badge number, the department he belonged to, and any written order authorizing his presence. The man's patience thinned almost immediately, and he told Elias he was interfering with an officer performing his duties. Elias did not move to open the gate. Instead, he picked up his phone and called the local police department's official non-emergency line, and the dispatcher confirmed that no unit had been sent to his address that morning or any morning that week. Elias pulled the camera footage and studied it frame by frame. The SUV's license plate had been partially obscured, just enough to blur automatically under low light. The uniform looked close to correct at a glance, but the badge was subtly wrong. The shield shaped a fraction differently than the real department's insignia, the patch on the shoulder stitched with the wrong thread color. Even the way the man carried himself was wrong, too stiff in the shoulders, too eager with his hands, like someone who had studied the role from a distance rather than lived it. Elias understood immediately that whoever this man was, he was not a police officer, and whoever had sent him wanted Elias to believe otherwise long enough to open the gate. The next day, a different man in the same uniform appeared at the same hour. The day after that, 2 of them came together. By the 4th day, 3 SUVs sat outside his fence at once, each one repeating the same tactic, each one hoping the psychological pressure of a badge and a uniform would eventually wear him down enough to let them in. Elias never raised his voice at any of them. He simply repeated the same request for identification, watched them fail to produce it, and closed the gate camera feed once they finally gave up and drove away. Each visit followed nearly the same script: a knock at the intercom, a demand phrased as routine procedure, a slow escalation in tone whenever Elias refused to comply. One man tried claiming there had been a report of livestock wandering onto the county road, another invoked a supposed noise complaint from a neighbor who did not exist, and a third simply stood at the gate in silence for nearly 10 minutes, as if hoping the sight of a uniform alone would be enough to unsettle an old man living by himself. Elias found their persistence almost instructive. He began timing their visits, noting how long each man waited before giving up, how often they glanced toward the cameras mounted along the fence, how their confidence dipped whenever he mentioned a badge number they could not produce. It told him they were not soldiers and not professionals in any real sense, only men paid to perform authority long enough to make someone else's problem disappear. That afternoon, Maribel called him directly, her voice carrying a strange, performed sympathy through the phone. "It sounds like you're having quite a bit of trouble," she said. "Do you know what's happening?" Elias asked. There was a pause on the line, several seconds too long to be accidental. "I know how this could end," she finally said, and then she hung up before he could respond. Elias stood in his kitchen for a long moment afterward, staring at the phone in his hand, understanding for the first time that this had never been about a real estate transaction at all. That evening, reviewing the footage one more time, Elias noticed something that made the hair rise on the back of his neck. One of the men in uniform, standing at the edge of the camera's range, looked directly into the lens as though he knew exactly where it was mounted. Then he raised his hand, slow and deliberate, and signaled to someone standing just out of frame, a gesture too precise to be casual, the kind of signal used by teams who had rehearsed a plan together more than once. Elias did not confront anyone directly after that. He understood confrontation was exactly what they wanted, a moment of anger caught on camera that could later be twisted into a story about a dangerous old man threatening innocent visitors. Instead, he built a case. He archived every video clip, every partial license plate, every timestamp, every recorded voice, every photograph his own cameras had captured, of vehicles and faces that did not belong to any department he could verify. He organized it the way he once organized security audits for clients who could not afford a single unaccounted variable, methodically, without emotion, with backups stored in 3 separate locations, one of them off the property entirely. Dorian Pike, meanwhile, kept sending letters, each one slightly more formal than the last, each one repeating the same demand dressed in slightly different legal language, urging Elias to reconsider the association's generous offer before circumstances changed. In a quiet moment one evening, sitting alone with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, Elias thought back to the decades he had spent designing barriers for facilities that could not afford a single breach. Chemical plants, data centers, private compounds owned by people who valued privacy above almost everything else. He understood, in a way few civilians ever would, exactly how a hostile group studied a target before attempting to move against it. They watched patterns. They timed routines. They probed weak points before committing to anything irreversible. They tested a target's willingness to call the authorities, and they tested how quickly that target grew tired or careless. His ranch, he knew, was not an easy target, and whoever was sending these men had clearly underestimated exactly what they were dealing with. Maribel, for her part, believed she understood Elias perfectly. She told Dorian, in a conversation she assumed would remain private, that the old man would tire out long before the association did. Dorian was not so certain. He asked her what would happen if Elias had been recording everything from the very beginning, if there was a paper trail connecting the fake officers back to anyone real. Maribel's answer came without hesitation. Then he won't have anyone left to believe him, she said. It was around this time that Elias began to suspect the men circling his property wanted something more specific than his signature on a sale agreement. They were not simply trying to intimidate him into leaving. They were searching for something on the land itself, something located in one particular area behind the old equipment barn, a patch of ground that had sat undisturbed for as long as Elias could remember. He noticed the pattern in the nighttime footage once he went back through it carefully. The figures never lingered near the house, never approached the front pastures, but always drifted toward that same forgotten corner of the property, as though drawn there by something they already knew was buried in the paperwork, not the ground. That night, he pulled decades-old paperwork out of a fireproof safe he rarely opened, deeds and survey maps passed down from his father, brittle at the edges and yellowed with age. Buried among the stack was an old plat map with a section marked in fading red ink, a small rectangle near the rear property line labeled, simply, restricted easement. Digging further into county records the following week, Elias began to understand the true shape of what was happening around him. Decades earlier, before the surrounding development existed at all, a right-of-way had been established across a narrow strip of his land, a legal corridor that had technically expired, but had never been formally erased from certain older filings. If someone controlled that corridor today, they could open direct access to a much larger, currently landlocked parcel behind his ranch, a parcel the Homeowners Association had quietly been trying to develop into a second, far more lucrative phase of luxury housing. Elias did the math slowly, carefully, the way he did everything, and arrived at a number that made the earlier offer look almost insulting. If that access route opened, the value unlocked behind his property could run into the tens of millions of dollars, dwarfing anything Maribel had offered him at that kitchen table. He understood then, with total clarity, that $4 million was never meant to be a fair price for his land. It was meant to be the cost of making him disappear from the equation entirely, quietly enough that no one would ask questions about what came next. He thought about how close he had come to simply accepting the number out of exhaustion, and how easily an offer like that could tempt a man who did not know exactly what he was sitting on. He spent the following 2 days quietly confirming what the old paperwork suggested, driving to the county recorder's office himself rather than trusting anyone else to pull the files for him. A clerk who had worked there for over 20 years remembered the original easement filing and mentioned, almost in passing, that a request had come through only months earlier asking for copies of the exact same records, filed under the name of a title company Elias had never heard of before. When he asked who had ordered the search, the clerk checked the log and found the request had been paid for by an account linked back to the Homeowners Association itself. It was a small detail, easy to overlook, but it confirmed everything Elias had already begun to suspect. Someone inside that association had known about the restricted easement long before the $4 million offer had ever been made, and the entire negotiation had been built on a foundation Elias was never supposed to discover. Maribel visited the ranch again, this time without Dorian, standing outside the gate with her arms crossed against the evening chill. "I have given you every opportunity," she said, her voice tighter than before. "No," Elias answered. "You've given me every reason to keep this place." Something in her composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for Elias to see it. She told him, in a voice stripped of its usual warmth, that the association would find ways to make the ranch unlivable, that his life there would grow harder with every passing month, until he finally understood there was no version of the future where he kept the land. Elias said nothing in return. That night, a section of his rear fence was torn open. The posts snapped and dragged aside as though something had rammed through with force. His cameras captured every second of it. Clear footage of a vehicle reversing away into the darkness, its taillights briefly illuminating the churned mud where the fence used to stand. Elias did not repair the fence right away. He left it exactly as it was, and he waited, and he added the footage to the folder he had already begun sharing, quietly, with an investigator he trusted from his years in the industry. The following morning, a genuine police cruiser rolled up to his gate, lights off, engine idling. Elias felt a brief flicker of relief, until the driver's door opened, and the man who stepped out was the same face he had already logged 3 separate times that week, the same fake officer from the very first morning, now somehow standing beside an actual patrol vehicle that did not belong to him. It was, Elias realized later, either a stolen vehicle or a borrowed one, and either possibility told him the operation reached further than a handful of hired men in costume uniforms. Elias understood immediately that the pressure campaign had entered a more dangerous phase, and that whatever protective measures he had relied on so far were no longer enough. He could not simply depend on a gate and a handful of cameras to keep 4 separate teams of aggressive men off his land indefinitely. It was time to activate something he had built years earlier and hoped he would never need to use. Beneath the long gravel driveway leading up to his house sat a network of steel bollards, hydraulic posts recessed flush with the ground, nearly invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. Elias had installed them himself, section by section, over the course of 2 quiet summers, designing the system the same way he had once designed barriers for clients whose lives depended on controlled access. Each cluster could be raised independently from a central control panel inside the house, and a battery backup kept the entire system operational even if the power to the property failed. He had never intended the bollards as a weapon. Their purpose was simple and defensive, to control exactly who could drive onto his land, and exactly when, without ever needing to raise his voice or reach for anything more dangerous than a switch. The fake officers kept coming, and their approach grew rougher with each visit. One SUV deliberately rammed the front gate, metal screeching against metal, and the gate held without giving an inch. Elias watched the impact from inside his control room, calm, unmoving, already recording a fresh file of evidence to add to the growing archive. He phoned the actual sheriff's department that afternoon and forwarded everything he had gathered, timestamps, photographs, partial plates, and the recorded phone call in which Maribel had all but confirmed she knew exactly what was happening on his land. The deputy who took the call promised to open a formal file, and for the first time in weeks, Elias felt the shape of the case beginning to turn in his favor. Maribel called him one final time that week, her voice low and cold. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," she said. "I think it's you who doesn't understand," Elias answered, and ended the call before she could respond. 2 mornings later, 4 SUVs approached the property at once, moving with none of the caution the earlier visits had shown. Elias watched them on his monitors as they lined up along the road, engines running, doors already cracked open. He understood in that moment that whatever restraint these men had shown before was gone entirely. They were done pretending to be patient. They were preparing to force their way onto the ranch, and Elias moved to his control panel with the same steady hands he had once used to arm systems, protecting buildings far more important than his own driveway. The 4 vehicles surged toward the gate together, and one man leaned out of a window with a bullhorn, shouting for Elias to open the property immediately. Elias did not answer. The steel gate remained sealed, its motors already locked down under his command, and the lead SUV accelerated as though it intended to punch straight through the barrier. Elias pressed a single button on the control panel in front of him, and the ground beneath the driveway answered. Rows of steel bollards rose from their hidden channels in less than 2 seconds, thick posts of hardened metal locking upward with a deep mechanical thud that echoed across the property. The lead vehicle struck the first row and stopped dead, its front end crumpling against steel that did not move an inch. The second SUV swerved, attempting to cut around the disabled vehicle, and a fresh cluster of bollards rose directly in its path, forcing it to a violent, screeching halt. The third vehicle tried reversing toward a side access route, only to find another set of posts already locked into place there as well. The fourth car spun around entirely, racing for the rear exit road, but that route had been sealed the moment the first alarm triggered, steel columns standing shoulder to shoulder across the only path out. Within seconds, all 4 vehicles sat trapped between 2 solid lines of steel, unable to advance, unable to retreat, unable to slip sideways around the barrier in either direction. Dust hung in the air over the driveway, and for a long moment nothing moved at all except the slow, useless spinning of tires against gravel. From inside his control room, Elias watched the scene unfold on 4 separate monitors, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself something close to satisfaction. He was not shouting. He was not threatening. He simply activated the external speaker system, mounted along the driveway, and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the trapped vehicles below. "You picked the wrong ranch," he said. One of the men shoved his door open and stumbled out onto the gravel, red-faced, shouting something about lawsuits and rights that no longer applied to him. Elias let the exterior speakers carry a second message across the property. "Every camera on this land is recording you right now," he said. The man froze, and above him, along the fence line and the barn roof and the eaves of the house itself, a dozen camera housings rotated in near-perfect unison, each lens turning to lock directly onto his face. Somewhere inside one of the trapped SUVs, a phone rang, and Elias, listening through the external audio pickup built into his perimeter system, heard the panicked voice of one of the men speaking rapidly into it. "Mrs. Crown," the man said, his voice cracking, "we're stuck. We can't move." Elias had already begun recording that call the moment the audio picked it up, adding it silently to the growing folder of evidence sitting on a secured drive in his control room. On the other end of the line, Maribel Crown ordered the men to disengage immediately, her tone sharp with a fear she rarely allowed herself to show. But there was nothing left for them to disengage from. 4 vehicles sat locked between rows of steel, cameras recording every second, and within minutes the sound of real sirens began drifting up the long county road toward the ranch. When actual patrol cars finally arrived, officers moved from vehicle to vehicle, pulling 4 men out one at a time and demanding identification that none of them could properly produce. It did not take long for the truth to surface. None of the men were police officers. Their uniforms had been purchased through a costume supplier 2 counties over. Their vehicles were registered to a private security contractor with a history of taking questionable jobs from clients who preferred not to ask too many questions about methods. Several of the men, once separated and questioned individually, began talking, each one eager to shift blame away from himself and toward whoever had hired them in the first place. One of them, barely 30 years old, admitted he had been told this was simple property intimidation work, nothing more than scaring an old man into signing paperwork, and that nobody had warned him he might end up trapped between rows of steel with real detectives asking real questions. Dorian Pike was brought in for questioning within the week, his composure fraying visibly under the weight of the investigation. Financial records subpoenaed from the Homeowners Association revealed a series of payments routed through an intermediary shell company, funds that eventually traced back to the very security contractor whose men now sat detained at the county jail. Maribel continued to insist, in every statement she gave, that the association had no knowledge of any illegal activity, that the men had acted entirely on their own initiative. Elias, sitting across a conference table from an investigator weeks later, produced the one piece of evidence that made her denial impossible to sustain: a recording of her own voice, captured through his perimeter audio system, directing the trapped men to disengage from an operation she claimed she knew nothing about. Renee Ashford's team also traced a pattern of similar complaints filed against other landowners near the edges of association territory over the previous several years, families who had sold small parcels quietly after facing strangely persistent code violations of their own. None of them had fought back the way Elias had. Most had simply grown tired, taken whatever offer eventually arrived, and moved away without ever understanding why the pressure had started in the first place. Investigators began reaching out to several of those former owners, and 2 of them agreed to give statements once they learned Elias's case had already exposed the scheme publicly. It became clear, piece by piece, that the ranch had never been an isolated incident, only the first target stubborn enough and prepared enough to refuse, quietly disappearing. The final blow came when investigators uncovered a folder inside the association's private files, a set of documents drafted months earlier, outlining a legal strategy to manufacture code violations and safety complaints, sturdy enough to justify forced acquisition of the ranch under provisions. The association had no legitimate authority. To invoke. At the bottom of one memo, beneath Maribel's own signature, a single line remained, unambiguous and damning. Acquire the ranch, by any means necessary. Investigators photographed the page, bagged the original, and quietly informed Elias that the case against Maribel Crown had just become considerably stronger. With that document in hand, the case against Maribel Crown and the Homeowners Association shifted from suspicion into something far more solid. County records confirmed exactly what Elias had suspected for weeks, that his ownership of the ranch was airtight, that no restriction, easement dispute, or association bylaw gave the board any legal standing to force a sale. The larger truth also came into focus during the investigation. The entire real estate expansion Maribel had been chasing depended entirely on securing access through Elias's land. Without his signature, without his gate, the second phase of luxury development the association had promised its wealthiest members simply could not happen. Every threat, every fake officer, every forged accusation had been aimed at solving that single problem, and every one of them had failed. Maribel arrived at the ranch one final time, alone, without Dorian, without her usual composure. She stood outside the gate that had defeated 4 vehicles, and asked Elias quietly what he wanted from her. "I want you to stop calling this a deal," Elias said. She said nothing, and he continued. "You never wanted to buy this ranch," he told her. "You wanted to take it." Dorian, facing his own mounting legal exposure, began cooperating fully with investigators, handing over emails, internal memos, and recorded conversations that corroborated everything Elias had already gathered on his own. He told investigators he had raised concerns about the plan more than once, quietly, never loudly enough to matter, and that he had convinced himself the risk was worth the fee Maribel had promised him once the second phase of development finally closed. The Homeowners Association called an emergency session once word of the investigation spread among its members, and for the first time in years, people who had once nodded along silently at every meeting began asking pointed questions about where association dues had actually gone. Unusual expenditures surfaced in the financial disclosures, payments Maribel had never adequately explained, invoices for services no resident had ever requested and no committee had ever approved, and within a month, the board voted unanimously to remove her from her position as president. But the story did not end there. Digging deeper into the financial trail, investigators uncovered a second layer beneath Maribel's scheme. A large regional real estate development firm that had been quietly funding the entire pressure campaign from behind the scenes. Treating Maribel and the association as a convenient front for a project the firm itself could never have pursued so openly. That firm now faced its own set of investigations, its executives suddenly answering questions about a rural property they had never publicly acknowledged any interest in at all. Their names appearing in filings alongside a woman most of them had only ever met through carefully worded emails and untraceable phone calls. The county attorney's office assigned a dedicated investigator to the case. Once the scope of the operation became clear, a soft-spoken woman named Renee Ashford who spent nearly 3 weeks at the ranch reviewing footage, cross-referencing timestamps, and interviewing every board member who agreed to talk. She told Elias, near the end of that process, that she had rarely seen a private citizen build a case as thoroughly as he had, and that his archive alone had likely saved the county months of work that would otherwise have depended on witnesses too frightened or too complicit to speak freely. Elias only shrugged at the compliment. He had spent 30 years building systems designed to withstand exactly this kind of pressure, and he had simply pointed that same discipline at his own front gate instead of somebody else's server room. In the months that followed, the security contractor lost its operating license entirely, and the men who had impersonated police officers on Elias's land faced formal charges for impersonation, trespassing, and conspiracy. Maribel herself was charged separately, her name appearing in local records for the first time, not as the head of a prestigious homeowners association, but as a defendant in a case that made the regional news. The development firm behind her, once shielded from scrutiny, found its name dragged into headlines it had spent years trying to avoid, and its stock quietly slid on the exchange the week the story broke. Through it all, Elias Voss kept his ranch exactly where it had always been, untouched, unsold, and now legally protected in ways even Maribel's lawyers could no longer challenge. Some of the same board members who had once sat quietly through Maribel's meetings, never questioning her methods, began showing up individually at Elias's gate, offering apologies he had not asked for and did not particularly need. One woman brought a basket of vegetables from her own garden, as though produce could undo the weeks of fear he had lived through. He listened to each one politely enough, but he did not soften, and he did not pretend the last several months had never happened. "I don't need any of you to like me," he told one of them, a man who had once voted in favor of every complaint filed against the ranch. "I just need you to respect a boundary." In the weeks after the investigation closed, Elias spent time reinforcing the systems that had carried him through the ordeal, upgrading the gate motors, expanding the camera network, refining the software controlling the bollard array beneath his driveway, and adding a second, independent power source, in case anyone ever tried to cut electricity to the property again. He was not interested in turning his home into a fortress, cold and impenetrable and joyless. The ranch had always been more than a piece of land to defend. It was the place he had chosen to live his life, and he intended to keep living it there exactly the way he always had, with mornings spent walking the fence line and evenings spent watching the light fall over the pasture, the same rhythm that had carried him through 30 years of a career most of his neighbors never fully understood. Word of what had happened traveled through the county slowly, the way most true stories do, passed between neighbors at feed stores and gas stations rather than announced all at once. A few reporters called asking for interviews, and Elias turned down every one of them, telling each caller the same thing, that the ranch had never needed an audience, only a fence that worked and a man willing to hold the line behind it. The Homeowners Association, restructured under new leadership within the year, sent him a formal letter of apology, along with a revised set of bylaws limiting how much power any single board member could ever hold again. Elias read the letter once, filed it away in the same fireproof safe where he kept the old plat maps and deeds, and never mentioned it again. He had no interest in being thanked for simply refusing to be moved. He thought often, in those quiet weeks, about how close the whole affair had come to ending differently. Had he been a younger man, less accustomed to reading threats hidden inside polite language, he might have taken the money simply to make the pressure stop. Had he been less careful with his cameras, less patient with his paperwork, the story might have ended with his name in the news for entirely the wrong reasons. An old rancher accused of erratic behavior, rather than a man who had quietly outlasted a conspiracy built to erase him. He did not consider himself lucky. He considered himself prepared, and he understood, better than most people ever would, that the difference between the two was usually the only thing standing between a family losing everything and a family keeping what belonged to it. On a quiet morning months later, mist settled low over the grass the way it always did that time of year, and Elias stood near his front gate with a mug of coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over land that had nearly been stolen out from under him. There were no black SUVs parked along the road anymore. No men in ill-fitting uniforms waited at the intercom pretending to carry badges they had never earned. No threatening calls waited on his phone. The steel bollards sat silent and hidden beneath the gravel, exactly where they belonged, ready but unnecessary. A system built for a fight he hoped never to repeat, but was grateful, in the end, to have won. A neighbor passing by on the county road slowed his truck and called out through the open window, half joking, half genuinely curious. "You ever regret turning down that $4 million?" the man asked. Elias considered the question for a moment, watching a hawk circle slow and patient over the far pasture before answering. He thought about the SUVs pinned between steel, the folder of evidence that had once seemed like an old man's paranoia and turned out to be the thing that saved him, and the quiet mornings he had nearly traded away for a number that was never honest in the first place. Then he shook his head slowly. "No," he said. He looked out across the ranch, past the barn, past the fence line, toward the hills rolling quietly into the distance, the same land his father had once walked and his father before that. "Some things," he said, "the higher the price someone offers you, the clearer it becomes that it was never supposed to be sold in the first place." The camera at the edge of the property panned slowly across the wide, open land, catching the gate one last time in the soft morning light. A single sign hung bolted to the steel, plain and unmistakable, the only words anyone ever needed to read before approaching that gate again. "Private property. Respect the boundary."